Hello, my name is Armetta Swan, and I would like to share 7 topics on the importance of knowing your history. The first, Africa's past. 1619, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, Civil Rights, the new Jim Crow / Black Lives Matter. Africa's past. In the Ashanti language, Twi, the name for God is Nyami. And in the Yoruba people of Nigeria, God's name is Olodumare. Their names were majestic and supreme and preeminent over all the earth and the heavens. The gods were omnipotent. The God was omnipotent, all-wise and all-knowing, a judge of all things. So strong was the appreciation for the sovereignty and justice of Olodumare that the Yoruba typically avoided seeking revenge for crimes perpetrated against them. A God of goodness and justice, a supreme deity, an immortal God, a sacrificial God. So the Africans who came to this country somehow found in this God from their African past all they needed to know. In the book Before the Mayflower, Lerone Bennett states that civilization started in the great river valleys of Africa and Asia, in the Fertile Crescent in the Near East, along the narrow ribbon of the Nile. They were among the first people to use tools, paint pictures, plant seeds, and worship gods. There was no problem being black. Bennett goes on to tell us that for 600,000 years, Africa and Africans led the world and they were honored. The countries of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were successful political countries, as well as Ethiopia. Ethiopia and Egypt, there was prolonged and intimate contact between dark-skinned Egyptians and dark-skinned Ethiopians. For 50 centuries or more, they fought, traded, and intermarried. At one time, Ethiopia was a tribute-paying dependency of Egypt. Then, in the middle of the 8th century BC, Kashta, an Ethiopian monarch, began the conquest, and his son, Pianki, completed the conquest. For more than a century, Ethiopians occupied the divine office of the pharaoh rulers like Shabaka, Taharka. The greatest of the Ethiopian pharaohs ruled for several centuries. The capital was moved further south to Meroe, where strong-willed queens called Candaces ruled Ethiopia. Bennett states, when the Arabs exploded and carried Islam across North Africa into Spain, Africans went with them. Africans explored other countries and converted to Islam. Trading and commerce flourished, and the intellectual life was stimulating. Young people from the Muslim world studied law, surgery at the University of Sankore. There were large collections of Greek and Latin manuscripts. However, the core of West African society was the family, the old and sick, the infirmed were cared for, and some tribes vaccinated for smallpox. In Isabel Wilkerson's latest book, Caste, she tells of a slave in Boston who recognized the disease, smallpox, that was raging at the time. This is in 1721. His name was Onesimus. Onesimus means useful. He told his master, Cotton Mather, that he recognized the illness from his country and told Mather of the procedure. Mather researched it and called it variolation. The Bostonians refused to take it and became violent. One doctor tried the new method and on his son and on enslaved people around him. And of the 240 people he inoculated, only 6 died. But 14% of Boston's population died. By 1750, vaccinations based on the method introduced by Onesimus would be standard practice. They saved hundreds of lives and eventually led to the eradication of smallpox. It remains today the only infectious disease to have been entirely wiped out. So back to Africa. Trade and commerce flourished, and the power and wealth of Ghana, Mali, Songhai, which stemmed from the trans-Saharan trade, traded gold, wheat, sugar, fruit, textiles, and salt. Bennett states that whatever tongue or color, Africans were deeply religious. They strongly believed in a supreme God who created the earth, and the life force of the Creator was present in all things. Art, like religion, was a life expression in which all people participated. Dancing, rhythms, music, all of these to the Africans was life and came with them to the Americas. I like that Bennett did not excuse what he claims was mean and base in African life. Africans practiced slavery, human sacrifice, and the use of man by man. The many who came to America in chains were strong, used to hard work, political responsibility, giving orders, the product of cultural traditions, heroic in nature. So Africans first reached America as adventurers or explorers. Estevanico became the actual explorer of the southwestern part of the United States, Arizona and New Mexico. These first Negroes brought over here were servants and companions because slavery had not been established at that time. In 1517, Bishop Las Casas recommended the importation of Africans to a Spanish colony in South Carolina. The Negroes who came to America in large numbers, however, were brought over some years after Africa had been opened up to European trading companies. The Portuguese were the first to deal in the black slave trade, established trading forts with dungeons along the Gold Coast. Other countries followed the Portuguese. The French in 1402, the English in 1530, Dutch traders in 1617. This European slave trade continued for more than 400 years. These first African captives in America were largely house servants, as mentioned before. However, in August 1619, a year before the Mayflower, a Dutch man of war stopped in Jamestown, Virginia, and the captain exchanged his human cargo for food. Anthony, Isabella, Pedro, and 17 other Africans with Spanish names came ashore, and the history of the Negro in America began. Anthony and Isabella, they fell in love, they married, and in 1624 gave birth to the first Negro child to be born in English America. They named their son William Tucker in honor of a local planter. They were free, could move about, and work. So, in Virginia and other colonies, these first Negroes were settlers. They lived with no idea of racial inferiority. Negro and white servants, Kenneth Stamp states in the Peculiar Institution, said that they seemed to be remarkably unconcerned about their visible differences. They worked together, they enjoyed leisure time together, and in and out of wedlock managed to sire numerous children. Indentured servitude could have continued for Negro and white servants, but because of socio-economic forces, the rulers of the early American colonies selected Negro slavery. In the West Indies, sugar was king, and in America, tobacco, cotton was king, and huge plantations needed to be built and more slaves to work the land in order to meet the global demand. Virginia and Maryland in 1660 believed Negroes were good material for slavery because they were not Christians. Between 1667 and 1682, the basis shifted to race. Then a series of laws stripped the Negro slave of all rights of personality and made color a badge of servitude. In 1710, the Negro population increased to 50,000. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, there were 500,000 Negro slaves. By 1860, 1 year before the Civil War, the 20 Negroes who landed at Jamestown in 1619 had become 4 million. So I want to give you a word, a Spanish word. It's called asiento. And this is a very important word because it was a contract that the Spanish colonies invented, and it gave power to other countries to capture slaves. So a pope gave Spain's colony in the New World, but Spain could not go into Africa, so they made money by giving other countries a contract. That contract is asiento. And if you had, this was a contract that was a national status symbol, that if you had an asiento, you were allowed to go into Africa and other countries and take slaves. That's 1619. So the African Americans kidnapped in Angola, and this voyage ended and they were sold for food. Now, today, the 1619 project that Nicole Hannah Jones wrote and received honor for, applied for tenure at the University of North Carolina. And After she was refused the tenure, her students complained, and the university reconsidered and voted her in to a tenured position 9-4. Nicole Hannah Jones refused the job. Instead, she took a position at Howard University. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The recruitment of black men to serve in the Civil War, the number was 179,000. And 40,000 of those black soldiers died. 30,000 of that 40,000 died of infections, died of diseases and infections. When Frederick Douglass was asked what was expected of black men and the recently freed black slaves, what was expected of them, and Frederick Douglass said nothing. Let them live, let them work, let them be educated, let them go just like you. I really love that spirit in him. So after the devastation of the Civil War, the Reconstruction period begins. The Reconstruction following the Civil War lasted for 12 years, 1865 to 1877. During these years, Negroes and whites were going to school together, riding on streetcars, and cohabitating in and out of wedlock. Negro men were marrying white women, but it was more common for white men to marry Negro women. In government, an ex-slave, Blanche Kelso Bruce, was representing Mississippi in the United States Senate. P.B.S. Pinchback was governor of Louisiana, and Robert Brown Elliott, a strong foe of racism and intolerance from South Carolina. Elliott supported Sumner's Civil Rights Bill and made, as Bennett states, the most eloquent speech ever uttered by a Negro in Congress. And when Alexander Stephens, former Vice President of the Confederacy, attacked the Civil Rights Bill, Elliott dismissed Stephens by giving him a history lesson of the Negro in America, who never failed to lift their earnest prayers for the success of this government. When the gentleman, Mr. Stephens, was seeking to break up the union of these states, the Democrats were so impressed because the applause that he received was so great. This is the Reconstruction period. Negroes were superintendents of education, state treasurers, solicitors, judges, and major generals of militia. 7 Negroes were sitting in the House of Representatives. An interracial board was running the University of South Carolina, where a Negro professor, Richard T. Greener, was teaching white and black youth metaphysics and logic. Now, all of this is on a higher level. But what of the masses? How was it with them? Bennett states they were struggling as they had always struggled, but with a difference. Now there was hope. These things, Bennett goes on to say, improbable as they may seem now, happened in America during 10 years, 1867 to 1877. This was part of the Black Reconstruction. The North took the longest stride America has ever taken. It decided to try democracy. because the Negro was in America to stay. What was to be done with the emancipated slaves? And here are three leaders who have made comments, men whose names we should never forget. Charles Sumner, a Massachusetts senator, stated, "Give him the ballot and treat him like a man." Thaddeus Stevens stated, he's a Pennsylvania congressman, "Give him 40 acres of land and treat him like a human being." The third one, of course, I had already mentioned, Frederick Douglass, who said, "Leave them alone, let them work, let them go to school, let them do what you do as a free man." But in the meantime, Congress passed a law that created the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau gave direct medical aid to 1 million freedmen, established hospitals, distributed rations, many of them poverty-stricken whites also, established day schools, night schools, and industrial schools. Another point of interest, practically all the major Negro colleges, Howard, Fisk, Morehouse, were founded or received substantial aid from the Freedmen's Bureau. And it wasn't enough. Tens of thousands died of diseases like tuberculosis. And because they were deprived of food, many of them starved. The slaves saw that freedom was not free without a firm economic foundation. Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens said it and cried when Congress refused to act on giving the slaves land. In South Carolina, land was given to the slaves in good faith, but President Johnson had pardoned the owners, and the land was to be returned to their owners, former owners. General O. Howard, head of the Freedmen's Bureau, went to South Carolina to explain, and as he faced the people, could not tell the people they had been taken again. He asked the people to sing him a song, and one old woman opened her mouth and sang, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." In 1865 to 66, President Johnson ignored Congress and appointed provisional governors who organized lily white governments. And these governments enacted the Black Codes, which re-established slavery under another name. They had restricted movement under vagrancy laws. They could not follow any occupation except menial work and farming, and the sharecropping systems. In other words, a reign of terror prevailed in many parts of the South. But Stevens and Sumner pushed on. Sumner got control of Reconstruction from President Johnson and placed that control in the Joint Congressional Committee of 15. The Reconstruction period ended in 1877 by the act of a man who was running for the presidency, John Rutherford B. Hayes, and he made a deal with the Democrats. He was a Republican, and he made a deal with the Democrats to take any advances that the rest of the advances that were made took them away from the Negro. The other important, another important point is that we have to remember that these men were working very, very hard. The 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves December 6, 1865. The 14th Amendment, June 13, 1866. And the 15th Amendment, February 26, 1869. There was a Civil Rights Act of 1866 in April, and a Civil Rights Act of March 1st, 1875. The election of 1876, both parties are claiming victory. Hayes makes a compromise that he will withdraw troops from southern states, and he wins the presidency by a single vote. Hayes begins in April 1877 to withdraw troops. With this act, the Democratic control of Confederate states is complete, ending the demise of Black Reconstruction after the Civil War. In the spring of 1879, approximately 6,000 African Americans act and refuse to live in a violent South and migrate to Kansas. One city, Nicodemus, Kansas, still exists today, and those who did not acted by staying, like Maggie Lena Walker, who at age 14 joined a floundering African-American fraternal and cooperative insurance society, the Independent Order of St. Luke. She later established a newsletter, department store, and the oldest Black-owned bank, becoming the first African-American woman to charter a bank in the United States. So with all these disappointments, there were still achievements that were made. I want to take a minute and look at the resiliency of Black people. I just talked to you a minute about Maggie Lee Walker and the schools that she helped establish. So this era that the United States worked on to reintegrate the states that had seceded, and also to determine the legal status of African Americans, it ended in 1877. The Jim Crow era, 1870 to 1954, that ended with Brown versus Board of Education. The desegregation of schools. It didn't stop all the segregation in transportation, eating establishments, cemeteries, theaters, separation of whites from persons of color, no contact between whites and blacks as equals. However, the resilience of African Americans proved to be phenomenal. They built churches, opened businesses, schools, calling them Sunday schools, and enjoyed and worked to raise their families. The Civil Rights period, which is, we talk about the Second Reconstruction. It began with that Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama, 1955 to 56. But what really ended the segregated busing and transportation in this country was a young girl, Claudette Colvin, who refused to give her seat like Rosa Parks did, and Attorney Fred Gray, he was a young attorney at that time, he defended her. Her case went to, along with 4 other women, went to the Supreme Court. It was called Broder versus Gale. And Victory Tuesday, November 13th, 1956, ended legal segregation on buses, but did not end racial prejudice. The new Jim Crow and Black Lives Matter, incarceration, police brutality, health care, a devastating account of many people jobless. Michelle Alexander writes in her book, The New Jim Crow, that we must challenge the civil rights community, all of us, to work with Black Lives Matter and place mass incarceration at the forefront of a new movement for racial justice. With these works, we look at the truth, we endlessly learn, we are inspired, and we continue to move forward in love.